Something that fans of Assassin's Creed have wanted for a while is a return to the original formula of Assassin's Creed. Formula that seemed to have been lost over this massive franchise in favor for large open-world RPG games. I'm not proud to admit I have spent money on and played every single mainline Assassin's Creed game. So I was curious as to what this $50 experience would be, as it was promoted as a return to the original formula. Sadly, I'm not very impressed. Assassin's Creed Mirage fails to deliver a super compelling story. It has a pretty uninteresting open world, but at least the core gameplay loop seems to be a love letter to already existing fans of this large franchise. Let's get the story out of the way because it was what I was looking forward to most going into this game. Assassin's Creed Mirage follows a character named Basim that's from the previous Assassin's Creed game. This is a standalone installment into the franchise, as you do not need to understand the story of the previous Assassin's Creed game to get the full experience out of Assassin's Creed Mirage. However, understanding that the previous Assassin's Creed game's story was a bloated mess might feel all too familiar even if you've only played Assassin's Creed Mirage. Even though the story of Assassin's Creed Mirage followed Basim as the protagonist, it seems like only 30% of the story really delved into Basim, with the other 70% focusing on uninteresting surface level side characters. I think conceptually the story of Assassin's Creed Mirage is interesting. The protagonist is struggling with visions that haunt him, and these haunting visions bleed into other areas of his life, causing him to become more volatile or maybe even more compelling, toxic, as the story progresses. This struggle, when given proper attention, is pretty interesting, even if not executed incredibly well. However, sadly, most of the attention is diverted elsewhere. Most main story quests have us follow pretty uninteresting side characters that give us no reason to care about them outside of meeting them pretty early on in the game. They feel like mediocre side quests in an RPG with how they're structured, especially when you start to realize that the game is broken into like 6 main chapters or segments, and 4 of those chapters or segments all follow an incredibly similar formula. These 4 sections could easily be broken down into one chapter or section, allowing the game to focus more on Basim through the 3 chapters of the game, and allowing the game to feel less like a DLC that was stretched thin. When I say a DLC stretched thin, it's referencing the fact that this game was developed originally as a DLC for the previous Assassin's Creed game that we mentioned earlier. The developers stated that there was so much passion for this DLC that it eventually blossomed into its own standalone isolated experience, being Assassin's Creed Mirage. I wish that passion was felt throughout the structure and execution of the story in this game. However, I'm sure that it originally being developed as a DLC made that execution hard to execute. On top of the structure feeling pretty awkward or weird, the execution of a lot of the scenes made it hard to care about what was going on in this world. The acting oftentimes didn't feel very authentic, or maybe it was the writing or the directing that made lots of the scenes feel far from real. It also didn't help that lots of the scenes had pretty awkward animations for lots of the characters, and a general stiffness that made lots of the scenes look very plastic. I do think I'm being super critical of the story, looking through the lens of it being a DLC for an already existing game and having a limitation on what you're able to do without turning it into a completely different thing. But as it is a $50 standalone experience, I think there's a lot to be desired through the narrative experience of Assassin's Creed Mirage. Another thing in Assassin's Creed Mirage that I would have hoped to have been made with more attention would be the open world in this game. I'm extremely far from the first person to say that an Assassin's Creed game's open world is lifeless, but I can't help but to bring it up when gathering my thoughts after playing through this game. It is very much an open world that you'd experience or see in an old Assassin's Creed game, but with a new coat of paint over top of it. I appreciate that the developers wanted to make the world feel very authentic and very historically accurate, as it's meant to be 9th century Baghdad. However, walking through Assassin's Creed Mirage's Baghdad felt very far from lifelike. Well, in a lot of areas anyways. The NPCs and different areas of Baghdad start to blend together after hours of play, and I'm sure that even if you wanted to make it visually look as accurate as it is, I don't know what 9th century Baghdad looked like, but they claim that it's a super accurate city. I'm sure that you could have interesting gameplay mechanics to break up these different sections, visuals aside. And the actual content in the open world is pretty shallow. The world feels like a playground for you to parkour through and collect a bunch of different collectibles that don't feel very rewarding outside of increasing the number of collectibles you have on the menu. And the side quests and contract content that's laid throughout the world is very uninteresting with pretty mediocre stories. Because the core gameplay loop is pretty fun, I honestly think that this open world would have been fine if it wasn't accompanied by a main story that didn't require you to go to many different sections of Baghdad that all felt the exact same, requiring you to do lots of content that all felt incredibly familiar, all too familiar. It's exhausting. Sadly, I was not fulfilled by this world, even as a fan of Assassin's Creed. I would be lying if I said I didn't have fun during the early hours of my playthrough, retreading what was familiar to me through parkouring this world with lots of different areas to parkour through, and in fetch quests that felt all too familiar to the older games. It was refreshing to me as a fan of the older games. However, I don't think that's an excuse for the lack of interesting gameplay mechanics throughout this world. Something that also invoked a feeling of familiarity whilst playing through Assassin's Creed Mirage was the core gameplay loop. However, unlike the open world, this was far more fun. The combat, stealth, and parkour in Assassin's Creed Mirage all feel like amalgamations of mechanics from previous Assassin's Creed games in a good way. The combat in this game is very much the sequential dodge parry attack combat from the old Assassin's Creed games through the lens of the more recent Assassin's Creed games and their engine. The largest difference, outside of the way that it looked with like animations and with this new coat of paint over top of it, would be that the combat in this game has a hard lock-on system instead of a soft lock-on system. So sometimes it's kind of annoying when you're locked on a specific enemy and you mean to dodge another enemy that's attacking you from a different direction, and that feels a bit awkward instead of just soft locking onto an enemy that your camera is like sort of placing you towards. And just like the older games, the combat is pretty whatever and just feels like a placeholder that does encourage you to go back and approach the situation more subtly. And approaching situations with subtlety did feel pretty rewarding, especially as a fan of the original Assassin's Creed games. Or maybe I should say fun instead of rewarding. Mirage takes a lot of the stealth systems from the previous Assassin's Creed games and forms them all into one more cohesive experience. And as silly as it sounds to say, this game is more cohesive because now there's a crouch button and a whistle button and an ultimate button and a bunch of tools that were in the previous Assassin's Creed games. It was fun. Approaching larger groups of enemies was fun when you had to think about how you're going to approach these different enemies with the number of tools, or if your ultimate ability is on cooldown or not. Although I imagine for people who are super into stealth games that this game gets pretty mundane after a while because it doesn't require a lot of strategic planning in how you approach different encounters. It trivializes encounters when you're able to aggro an entire camp and just throw a smoke bomb at your feet and like jump into a bush. And then the guards will act like they've never saw you in their life. It's far from a super streamlined experience, but it's a fun overall experience if you just want to kill time or decompress, which, I don't maybe isn't the greatest sell. Sadly, I don't think having a just fun gameplay experience or gameplay loop is enough when it's paired alongside a pretty mediocre story and dull open world for the asking price of $50. It really does seem like a DLC that was stretched thin, and if this 18-ish hour experience for me was shortened a good bit and cheaper, I probably wouldn't be nearly as critical. Assassin's Creed Mirage is an Assassin's Creed game through and through, from its interesting fantasy of tormenting bad guys as like a sick-ass looking assassin with sci-fi stuff behind the scenes, to its very dull open world and bloated story.